Now, I know there's a lot of breaths out there and there's a lot of ways to move energy, but I want to give you a little bit of the science and a little bit of the body physiology to understand why we're doing this breath. So, most people think that there's a mind and that there's a body, and that the two are very separate entities. That in the 1700s, when Descartes was interested in doing his scientific experiments on the body, he viewed the body as something as very objective, and he saw the mind as very convoluted and very subjective. And he said, okay, well look, the mind is a little bit too unpredictable. I'm going to leave that to the church, and we'll call that the sphere of religion. And the body tends to be more objective and more studyable, so we'll call that the sphere of science. But I want you to know that there's never a time where your mind isn't influencing your body, and there's never a time where your body isn't influencing your mind. Every time you have a thought, there's a biochemical reaction in your brain. When you begin to think about something, you turn on different circuits in your brain. All of a sudden, another part of the brain begins to release a chemical, and that chemical causes you to begin to feel exactly the way you were just thinking. So if you have an insecure thought, in a matter of seconds, you begin to feel insecure. Now, the moment you start feeling that feeling, those emotions, the brain is constantly monitoring how your body's feeling. And all of a sudden, the moment the brain notices that you're feeling insecure, you're going to begin to generate more corresponding thoughts equal to the way you were just feeling. So you'll think more insecure thoughts, which will produce more chemicals for you to begin to feel more insecure. And then the moment you feel more insecure, you're going to begin to think more insecure thoughts. And that loop, that cycle of thinking and feeling is what creates your state of being. So, if you keep thinking thoughts like, my boss is unfair, I hate my job, what an idiot driver, I can't take my life, you keep thinking those thoughts, you keep producing the same chemicals, and you begin to cause different parts of your brain to influence another part of your brain, and that other part of your brain, in the limbic brain, begins to make what's called neuropeptides. Those neuropeptides are chemical messengers that begin to signal different hormonal centers. So if you're thinking frustrating and angry and hateful and judgmental thoughts, you're going to begin to feel that way because the neuropeptides that are made in your limbic brain are going to signal your adrenal glands in your third center and make you feel pretty aroused. The moment you feel that feeling, you're broadcasting energy out of this third center. And when you're feeling those emotions, your brain is monitoring that you're feeling pretty angry and frustrated and judgmental and hateful. And you're going to drive those thoughts even further. So now you're going to fire more thoughts equal to the way you're feeling, hardwiring your brain into a very specific pattern, and continuously produce the same emotions in your body. Over time, the repetition of thinking and feeling and feeling and thinking takes all of that thought and stores it as energy emotionally in the third center. And now the body's becoming the mind of anger and frustration and hatred and judgment. Not a lot of people spend a lot of time opening their heart. Not a lot of people spend a lot of time trusting and to be vulnerable because it would go counter to the conditions in their environment. And if they're living in survival, they're living in stress, and they're getting the rush of adrenaline from the hormones of stress, they become very attached to those emotional states, almost addicted to them in a sense. So then it makes sense that it's not a time to open their heart. It's not a time to be vulnerable. It's not a time to trust. It's time to run, fight, and hide. So most people then have most of the energy stored in their body in those first three centers, and so there's got to be a way to begin to pull the mind out of the body and to begin to liberate that energy. Now, your body is a magnet, and a magnet has a north pole and a south pole. And the stronger the polarity between the north pole and the south pole, the more the magnet has an invisible electromagnetic field. And Asian cultures have known about the body as a magnet for thousands and thousands of years. And as the current moves from the North Pole to the South Pole, the movement of polarity of the current begins to produce this invisible electromagnetic field. Most people can't see it, but it exists. And if you took a piece of paper and you laid it down and you put metal shavings on top of it, you put a magnet on top of those metal shavings, all of a sudden all those metal shavings would align themselves within the electromagnetic field of the magnet. In other words, energy is influencing matter. So then, if you're drawing from this invisible field of electromagnetic energy that's surrounding your body and living in survival and turning it into chemistry, and you're reducing the electromagnetic field around your body and thinking and feeling in the same cycle, and you're causing all that energy to be stored in the first three centers and it's not moving, then your body becomes like a piece of metal with no electromagnetic field, like a magnet with no charge, just an inert piece of metal. There's no field and there's no charge. So the breath that we do is a way to begin to move energy from those first three centers all the way back up into the brain. And we do it to run a current through the body and to produce an electromagnetic field, just like a magnet. So, how do we do it? So you have a bone at the base of your spine called the sacrum. It's an upside-down triangle. It has a plateau on the top. And that plateau is a base that the spinal column sits on. Now the spinal column goes from your lower back all the way up, right up into this ivory cavern called your skull. And that closed system of the spinal column, the brain, and the sacrum houses the most delicate system in your body called the central nervous system. Now, your central nervous system controls and coordinates all other systems in your body. You couldn't digest your food, you couldn't blink your eyes, you couldn't void your bladder, you couldn't move, your heart couldn't beat. Nothing would happen without the aid of your nervous system. In fact, your nervous system is like the electrical wires that run the machine. Now, in that closed system, the bony structures that protect the most delicate system, the brain and the spinal cord being an extension of the brain, there's fluid inside that closed system called cerebral spinal fluid. Now, cerebral spinal fluid has some important roles. The first thing is it creates buoyancy for the nervous system to float. It acts as a protective cushion in case there's trauma. The bony edges of certain areas of the skull can move without being traumatized. The cerebral spinal fluid has pathways that transfer chemicals and neurotransmitters to other parts of the nervous system, like rivers. And the act of that cerebral spinal fluid bathing the brain and the spinal cord really facilitates electrical charges in the nervous system, so it amplifies conductivity in the nervous system. So there's little filters in the brain that filter blood and create cerebral spinal fluid. So when that sacrum at the base of your spine works with your skull, every time you inhale, normally take a small breath, your sacrum flexes slightly back, and when you exhale, it flexes slightly forward. At the same time, when you inhale, the sutures of your skull open up, and when you exhale, the sutures close. So imagine then, when you inhale, the sacrum flexes back, the skull bones open up, and that cerebral spinal fluid can drain. When you exhale and the sacrum flexes forward and the sutures close, it propagates a wave and pushes the cerebral spinal fluid forward. So the act of moving that sacrum along with the coordination of the skull propagates a little wave. And as it moves and begins to move that cerebral spinal fluid by inhaling and exhaling, slowly those molecules move all the way up through the spinal cord, all the way up to the brain through 4 different rooms called aqueducts or ventricles, and then it comes all the way down. And if you were to tag one molecule of cerebral spinal fluid, it would take about 12 hours for that whole process to take place. So, what would happen if you were to contract your intrinsic muscles, your perineum, the muscles you use for intercourse and elimination, your lower abdomen and your upper abdomen? As you contract those intrinsic muscles and lock down the muscles associated with these first 3 centers and squeeze. If you were to squeeze these muscles, the act of squeezing these muscles begins to move the cerebral spinal fluid up in this direction. What if you were to take your attention and place it on the top of your head? Where you place your attention is where you place your energy. And I ask you to work your fingernail into the top of your head if I ask you to take your hand down, could you still feel that point? That's your target. And what if you were to couple a breath, one slow, steady breath, with the intention of pulling the mind out of the body? And you were to inhale, and the exact same time that you inhale, contract those intrinsic muscles and follow your breath from your perineum, through your lower abdomen, through your upper abdomen, through your chest, through your throat, through your brain, all the way to the top of your head. And when you got to the top of your head, I asked you to keep those muscles contracted and hold your breath with your attention on the top of your head. As you inhale and you contract those intrinsic muscles, you begin to accelerate that cerebral spinal fluid back towards your brain. Now, cerebral spinal fluid is made of proteins and salts in solution. If you take a protein and a salt and you drop it in solution, they begin to create a charge. So cerebral spinal fluid is made of charged molecules. So when you inhale and you contract those intrinsic muscles and you begin to pull that energy from those lower centers up into your brain, as you accelerate this cerebral spinal fluid, if you take a charged molecule, this is physics now, and you accelerate a charged molecule in one direction, it creates an invisible field in the movement of that charged molecule called an inductance field. If you accelerate several charged molecules, you create a bigger inductance field. So now, you have information that's traveling up and down your spinal cord from your brain to your body and from your body to the brain. You're paying attention to the pain in your back, you're paying attention if you're hungry, you got information coming from your brain instructing your body to do certain things. So this fiber optic cable has got communication going up and down. The moment you contract those intrinsic muscles and you inhale and you start accelerating that cerebral spinal fluid up towards your brain and you create this inductance field, the movement of this inductance field up towards the brain begins to draw energy from the centers, lower centers, in this direction. So all the energy you use for orgasm, all the energy you use to digest a big meal, all the energy you use to run from a predator, instead of it being released out, it's going to be released up. And when this is done properly, with a level of intensity, a level of passion that's greater than any addiction to any emotion, and you use your body as an instrument to ascend your energy, if you do this properly, you are waking up a sleeping dragon. And as that energy begins to come uncorked, as it begins to move up your spine, the moment that energy starts moving up in this direction, the sympathetic nervous system switches on and it merges with the parasympathetic nervous system. Now, your sympathetic nervous system is usually what you use to run from a predator when the body gets aroused. But in this case, the arousal is coming from within. And as you begin to elevate your energy and move this energy, when that energy starts moving and the sympathetic nervous system literally ejaculates that energy up into your brain, that energy starts moving up your spine, and there's a little gate at your brainstem called the thalamic gate. And that thalamic gate is what edits information going from your brain to your body and from your body to the brain. And there's a cluster of nuclei called the reticular formation that's a net-like formation, a labyrinth where things have to move. When this energy starts to move and it gets to the brainstem and it's moving and the sympathetic nervous system is switched on, that thalamic gate opens up. And when that thalamic gate opens up and that energy is forced into the brain, once that energy makes it past the thalamic gate, it hits these little junction boxes, the thalamus in the brain, 2 of them, and it sends information to the higher brain centers. And the moment that happens, the brain goes into gamma brainwave patterns, a very, very superconscious state. We've measured this hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of times in our students. Now, gamma is superconsciousness. Gamma is now the same similar frequency as high beta, but in this case, the arousal is not coming from some threat in your outer environment. The arousal is coming from your body, and that energy is moving back into the brain.